Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well, and it's a privilege for me to be sharing again in this session. It's a very grey and wet day today in London, so I hope that there is some sunshine where you are. And this is the second or the third session now of a series of 6 sessions on bioethics. Just to recap, yesterday we talked about building a bridge between the secular world and the world of the Bible. And then I introduced the idea of 4 foundations of biblical ethics. They are creation, fall, redemption, and future hope. And we haven't got time to go through all the 4 foundations in this series. So I have, yesterday we looked at number 1, creation. And then today we're going to look at number 3, which is redemption, incarnation and redemption. And it's a wonderful theme by which we see how God can transform evil and corruption and the work of the evil one, how everything can be redeemed through the power of God's grace, through the Holy Spirit, and in the person of Jesus Christ. So I'm now going to, as we go through this video, please think about questions that you would like to raise. And of course, we're thinking, how do we apply this to the world of healthcare? How do we learn how to be effective doctors and health professionals? And so I'd like you to play the video now, and then there'll be a time for Q&A. Hello, this is John Wyatt, and this is one of a series on the principles of medical ethics. So there are 4 foundations. There is creation, there is fall, there is redemption, and there is future hope. And today we're looking at the third of those, and on the wonderful theme that God doesn't just create us as a pathetic and fragile and vulnerable carbon-based life form, and say, well, good luck with that. It's going to be hard and tough, but all the best, it's going to be difficult. But something far more amazing and wonderful happens, because God himself, the God of the cosmos, the God of total power, chooses voluntarily to turn himself into a humble, pathetic, fragile, carbon-based life form. For the ancients, this was actually scandalous and even disgusting. For ancient philosophers, they could just about believe that God might appear in some kind of human form, but the idea that God was actually turn himself into a real human baby was just disgusting and scandalous. And yet, that's what the Christian faith teaches us. And in other words, God chooses to make himself dependent. And he can do nothing for himself. He has to be fed, he has to be washed, he has to have his bottom wiped. And at the end of his life on the cross, the God of the universe, the God of total power, chooses to make himself utterly and totally dependent. And through parched lips he croaks, "I am thirsty." And this is such an extraordinary paradox. But what we see in the Incarnation, in the person of Jesus, we see, as one theologian put it, God's final vote of confidence in the original human model. So God's great plan is not to start again with a clean sheet of paper. It's to take this old fallen humanity and transform it and redeem it after his image. And God, in the person of Jesus, has experienced every phase of human existence. As another theologian put it, he was with us in the darkness of the womb, as he will be with us in the darkness of the tomb. So there's this wonderful sense of the Incarnation is of God coming alongside, Emmanuel, God with us. And this teaches us something about the extraordinary dignity of human beings. It's also important that at the very moment that he is in the manger in Bethlehem, and so dependent on every aspect of his humanity. At the same time, the Christian faith teaches us that he is the second person of the Trinity, who is upholding the universe by the very word of his power. So in other words, his divine dignity and his status is in no way touched by his dependence. And the same is true for us. If we become utterly and totally dependent, so imagine yourself, as you might be in the future, in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of every orifice and depending on others to care for you and to wash you. Your unique status and dignity as a beloved princess or prince of the Most High is in no sense touched by your dependence. There's a wonderful, even more mind-blowing aspect of this which Luke records in the first chapter of his Gospel. And this is the homely story of Mary and Elizabeth meeting. So Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit, and she says, "Why should I be so favoured that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy." And Luke uses a particular word for the leap. It's not just a normal baby movement, but it's like a huge ecstatic leap for joy. So why did Luke put this little incident into the Gospel? Well, I think he saw that it showed something very profound. From the outside, there are only two people in this room. There's Mary and Elizabeth. But actually, what Luke saw is there were four people in the room. There was Mary and there was Elizabeth, and there was the unborn John the Baptist, and there's the unborn Jesus. So in this picture, you can see the different stages of development, and we can work out where John the Baptist and Jesus were, roughly. So John the Baptist is the child in the middle and the top. He's at about 28 weeks gestation, and he's leaping for joy at the presence of Jesus. And where is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the little one in the middle at the bottom, maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks gestation. And yet Elizabeth, filled with the Spirit, says, "The mother of my Lord." And my Lord is a tiny little being that's a few millimeters long. Isn't that an amazing and wonderful miracle? And yet God chooses to reveal himself like this, as a tiny, pathetic and vulnerable being. This is actually a picture of my hand and of one of the babies on the baby unit. I've looked at this picture many times and reflected about it. And one of the things I've asked myself is, where is God in this picture? How do I think of God? Is God like the big hand and I'm the little hand? And he's the big hand who's supporting me and I'm the tiny little one who's clinging on. And yes, many times in my life, it's felt like that. I'm the tiny little hand. But you know, amazingly and wonderfully, you can spin the image round and God chooses to make himself the little hand. He chooses to make himself fragile and dependent in order to show his glory and his character in weakness and dependence. So this teaches us that even the most fragile and vulnerable of human beings are those we should treat with respect and with wonder. And for me, as a paediatrician and as a baby doctor, this thought made quite an impact on me, because I realized one day that I had to treat the babies in my care, however small and vulnerable and pathetic, I had to treat them with wonder and with respect in just the same way that Mary and Joseph would have treated their newborn baby all those years ago. So because Jesus was a baby, all babies are special. Because Jesus was a fetus, all fetuses are special. Because Jesus was a dying man, all dying people are special. And also, you know, this teaches us that our humanity is not a barrier which comes between us and God. It's the very means by which God chooses to reveal himself. So what does this mean? Well, it means we must defend the preciousness of every human life, because this is the form in which God becomes flesh. Also, as we see the Son of God in human form, we see that he was involved and emotionally engaged. Luke in chapter 7 describes this well-known incident where he sees Jesus is by a chance encounter meets a widow at a funeral, and she's burying her only son, her precious and only son. And Luke records something quite remarkable. He says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. And Luke uses a technical term, splanchnizomai. And those of you who've done anatomy will recognize splanchnic, the splanchnic nerves which deal with the bowels. In other words, Literally what Luke says is that Jesus' bowels were moved, or in contemporary English, he was gutted. Time and again, the gospel writers point out that Jesus was deeply emotionally engaged with those he came to heal. He didn't explain their suffering. What he did is that he entered into it. He was emotionally involved. One of the quotations I've come across and have used many times says this: suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. So as healthcare professionals, we can't always explain, in fact, often we can't explain the suffering, the ultimate meaning of the suffering of our patients. But what we can do is we can be the presence, we can be the hands of Christ as we reach out to be with those who are suffering. And in my experience as a clinician, there is no higher calling than to be the presence of Christ with those who are suffering. What is clear is that God's plan in this age is not to abolish suffering, but it is to redeem it. It's to bring blessing and healing out of evil and pain. And I've become convinced that there is no evil situation, however twisted, however malevolent, however apparently meaningless, which cannot in some sense be transformed by God's grace and power into blessing and healing. But this process of healing and transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires our willing acceptance and cooperation with God's love and power working through the Holy Spirit. And so as we practice our healthcare, we should be looking out for examples in which by God's grace, apparently meaningless and terrible situations can be transformed by God's power into blessing and healing. And one example that made a big impact on me years ago were some close friends of ours, Alan and Verity, who were looking forward to the birth of their first child with great anticipation, but then it turned to tragedy because scans showed major abnormalities, and it turned out that this baby had trisomy 18, or Edwards syndrome, and that the chances were the baby would die either before birth or within days or weeks after birth. And in this situation, many obstetricians would strongly recommend that an abortion should be carried out, because what possible reason would there be to carry on through the pregnancy if you know that the baby is going to die anyway? But after a lot of heart-searching, Alan and Verity, who are strong Christian believers and members of our church, All Souls in London, they said, how can we destroy this baby that God has given us? And so the pregnancy continued, and little baby Christopher was born. And he had all the signs of Edwards syndrome. He had severe abnormalities of the heart and the brain. But he was a lovely little baby who they were able to take home. And to everyone's surprise, in fact, he survived for several months. And they used to bring Christopher along to our church, All Souls, where he became like a little mini celebrity. And he made a real impact on the church at the time. I remember how so many people were touched by his life and by the faith of his parents. And then after about 7 months, he became weaker and weaker, and he gently passed away at home. And there was a memorial service at All Souls, and over 400 people turned up to pay tribute to this tiny, pathetic little baby with lethal malformations. And when he died, he was the same weight as when he was born. He was still about 2.5 kilograms. And one of his parents, Alan and Verity's friends, said, you know, Christopher couldn't grow, but he helped other people to grow. It's not that there wasn't still tears, and still are, the deep loss of the child. But nonetheless, this wonderful message that through the Holy Spirit, these situations can be redeemed and transformed into blessing and healing. And I think as we practice as healthcare professionals, we should be looking and trying to be part of the process by which, out of the terrible evil of suffering and disease and death, God can bring blessing and healing. Finally, I want to mention that in the New Testament, suffering is seen, yes, as an evil, but also paradoxically as a gift of grace. So in Philippians chapter 1, Paul, writing to suffering Christians, says, it has been granted to you, and the word literally is charizomai, which means grant, a grace gift. It has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. So what are the implications for healthcare? Well, I think, yes, we are called to be the presence of Christ as we care for those who are suffering, just in the way that God himself steps into human suffering in the form of Jesus. We are called to be his hands, to be the hands and the presence of Christ with those who are suffering. And also, we must expect that at some times our own Christian service will be touched by the grace gift of suffering. It's part of the normal Christian life, and it's something that shouldn't surprise us, but something that we should be prepared for. Finally, we're called to look beyond the mystery of the sufferings of this age with joy, because of the new age that is to come. Because the story doesn't finish at the cross. There is resurrection, there is transformation, and there is the new heaven and the new earth. So we've been looking at the story of incarnation and of redemption. How does this understanding of incarnation change our understanding of the nature and being of God himself? How does it change our understanding of humanity? And how should it affect our practice as healthcare professionals? Secondly, to what extent should we be emotionally engaged with our patients? What are the benefits and the risks of this? And how should we guard against the dangers? Thirdly, can you give an example in which by God's grace, suffering and evil was changed into blessing and healing? What can you learn from this example? Well, thanks for watching. That's the end of this talk. I hope you'll join us again as we look at some more of the foundations of the Christian faith and how that relates to practice as healthcare professionals.
You know, I think this is a real problem with bioethics. It's the way that it's taught so often in medical schools and sometimes in Christian conferences as well. And that is, we focus entirely on the kind of dilemmas, the issues, as you said, like abortion and euthanasia and other classical ethical dilemmas. Now, of course, these are all important, and in this series of talks, we will definitely address some of these issues. But the problem with bioethics is that we mustn't start there. We have to lay the foundations. And in particular, the problem, you see, is that bioethics has really come out of the States and the West, this modern discipline of bioethics. And it is designed as an entirely secular and atheistic understanding. If you read, for instance, the Journal of Medical Ethics, or you read the textbooks of medical ethics, or the way that these are taught in medical school, they start with the assumption that human beings are just random machines. There is no God. There is no meaning or purpose in life. And we'd have to invent our own ideas of right and wrong. And sometimes Christians cannot understand because they try to engage in bioethics and they try to argue, and people just say, oh, you know, you're just a religious fundamentalist. You have nothing to offer. So that's why if we are going to really allow the truth to change us and to change our practice, we have to build these deep foundations. And so I don't in any way apologize for spending time talking about creation and fall and redemption, because I have learned for myself, until I learn how to really indwell these truths in my own heart and life, I cannot be the hands of Christ in my work. And so, you know, this is much more just than an intellectual thing. It's not just I need to understand some ethical principles. It's much deeper than that. We have to allow the truth to penetrate into our heart. We have to allow the Holy Spirit to show us afresh the wonder, because these truths are wonderful, that God turns himself into a baby, that he reveals himself in weakness and dependence, and that through the cross, however much there is evil and suffering, actually it can be changed and turned through his grace into blessing and healing. These are wonderful truths, And we need to build on these foundations, and then we can start to think about abortion, we can think about euthanasia, we can think about all the other ethical problems that we face in our practice. Often bioethics is taught, you may have heard about the 4 principles of bioethics with long, difficult names. They talk about beneficence, the principle of doing good, and non-malevolence, the principle of not doing evil, and autonomy and justice. These are wonderful principles, and medical students can write it all down, and they try and memorize it all. But the truth is, without these foundations, those principles, I'm afraid, have very little meaning. And what does it, let's just take the question of abortion, you know, what does it mean to do good in abortion? Is it doing good to the mother or to the baby? Is it doing good to the baby to destroy its life? How do you balance doing good to the mother and doing good to the baby? And the principle of not doing harm, well, am I doing harm by allowing the baby to live, or am I doing harm by destroying the baby? And so on. So I think many people find that although these principles sound good, they don't actually help much. I mean, not completely. I don't want to dismiss the whole thing, but they are much less helpful than you think they would be, because you can turn these principles into whatever you like. And so I have heard many atheistic people taking these principles and using them to do something which I believe is quite evil. So that's why I think as Christian believers, our first task is to start to build foundations. Again, I come to this principle of the bridge. Until we build strong foundations on both sides, we're not going to be able to build the bridge. So yes, we need to understand how bioethics works in our medical schools, in our hospitals and so on. But we do need to build our Christian foundations if we want to have a bridge that works. Of course, we cannot avoid these kind of dilemmas. Many of us, when we were working in our hospitals, and this is a dilemma that I frequently addressed in my own clinical practice. I was working as a neonatologist in a major center in central London, and in many cases I was asked to counsel a woman who had a major fetal abnormality, and she was being offered an abortion because in the UK, that is the law. It's legal to have an abortion at any stage up to term gestation if there is a fetal abnormality. And I was asked to advise, and of course I have to follow the law in the UK. I cannot and the principles. So I have to be very careful. I'm walking a tightrope about what I'm allowed to say, what I'm not allowed to say. But at the same time, I'm praying silently, Lord, guide my lips, help me to show this woman respect and care. And if I can just very briefly explain something I found very helpful, and that is when I am called in this kind of very difficult situation to do what is right, I should draw a distinction between what my desires are, what I long for in this consultation, and what my goals are for the consultation, because they're not the same thing. So if my desires, what are my desires? My desires, to be honest, is that this woman would learn to see that the baby in her womb is still a precious being made by God, that this life is precious, and that she would have the courage to be able to continue the pregnancy and to love this baby, whatever the cost is. That is my desire. I long for that to happen because I genuinely believe that that is the right thing. I genuinely believe that the destruction of a life that God has given is something that is wrong. It is homicide. It is to take and destroy a human life. So My desire is that she should continue the pregnancy, but I can't make it happen because in the law, she has a choice. She has autonomy, and that autonomy is protected by law. And also, she is a woman made by God in God's image, and God gives her the freedom of choice. So I must not manipulate or pressurize her. So what are my goals? My goals are that she should feel respected and listened to, treated with respect and compassion and empathy, that I give her honest and accurate information, that I explain how it would be possible to care for this child even if there were multiple abnormalities, and that if necessary, we can provide palliative care and make sure the baby will not suffer. And, maybe I will spend half an hour or even an hour sharing and answering this woman's questions. And then when I go away from that consultation, if I hear that the woman has decided to have the abortion, I feel sad, but I don't feel guilty. As long as I have achieved my goals of trying to show the love of Christ, of giving honest and accurate information, of showing empathy, then I recognize she has a choice. I feel very sad if she's destroyed that life, but it is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to offer hope. But if I was asked, will you do the abortion? I would say no, I refuse. Thankfully, in the UK, we have the right of conscientious objection. So I cannot be forced to take a life, and I would refuse. I would say, I'm very happy to talk, I'm very happy to share and counsel, but I will not take the action of destroying the life. Pregnancy by rape is seen by many people, including by many Christians, as surely the compassionate thing to do is to destroy the life when it has been created by rape. And of course, rape is a terrible and tragic situation. But I honestly believe, even in these tragic situations, to do an abortion is not the loving thing to do. And actually, my wife is involved in a crisis pregnancy center here in London. She has counseled many women who have become pregnant through rape. And in fact, we know of several women who have found with the right support and love to love this child and to continue the pregnancy. And we have seen that although that may create many, many emotional struggles and difficulties, that it is better to vote in terms of life and to care for this child. So why isn't rape a solution? Well, take a woman who has been raped. She's already had this terrible violation of her personhood, of her femininity. She's been forced and raped and sexually abused. So what is the answer? Well, you're going to do another violation. Now, what you're proposing is to kill the baby in her womb. This is not treatment. This is also a violation because the woman knows that this is her baby as well. However evil the way this baby came into the world. And so to destroy the baby in her womb is to add one evil on top of another evil. And it doesn't solve the problem. There is lots of evidence that women who have been in this situation and have an abortion, my wife has counseled many of them, and many of them actually have long-term feelings of guilt, of failure, of shame. Whereas interestingly, the women who have continued the pregnancy and who have been supported and loved and cared for, my wife says, yes, they have struggles, yes, there is sadness, but there is no shame. In fact, they are proud of what they have achieved. If you're interested in this, I discuss this quite a lot more in my book, Matters of Life and Death. But I am absolutely convinced that even in these terrible cases, caring and bringing life into the world and supporting, of course we support. We don't just say, well, go away, have your baby, I refuse to help you. That's not Christ-like. My wife's charity in London, we provide support throughout the pregnancy. We provide baby clothes, baby equipment. We provide friendship and befriending. We provide advice about being a parent, a single parent. We provide support to how you can get benefits from the government to support you as a parent. And so We show practical, caring Christian love. We say life is better than death. Well, I do understand this terrible dilemma where you feel that if I refuse to do the abortion, then she will have the abortion somewhere else and it may be very, very dangerous and she may die as a result. But you know, it's a biblical principle that you do not do an evil so that another evil is not done. That is not, can you see Jesus doing this abortion? Can you see him saying, I will destroy the life of this baby, this precious baby, because another greater evil will happen? I don't believe you can. I think the Christian principle is always to say, whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately say, well, here is a better way. So what's wonderful in the UK is there is now this whole movement of Christian crisis pregnancy centres, where there are Christian volunteers who will provide practical help, who will provide equipment and support and compassion and love for women in this situation. And wouldn't it be wonderful if across India and if across Nepal and across all the countries of Southeast Asia, there were these Christian crisis pregnancy centers where Christians are showing that life is precious, where Christians are showing how we value the life of the tiniest and malformed baby. And so I pray to God that he, by the Spirit, will move people's hearts to set up these kind of centers. Whenever we say that something is wrong, that abortion is wrong, we must immediately say, and here is a better way. Here is the way of Christ. Here is the way of compassion. Here is the way of love. I am not what is sometimes called an absolutist, and that is, you never know. That in medicine, there are always the most bizarre, strange, extreme circumstances that happen. I have, in my career, met the most strange and baffling situations, and I've been agonized about what is the right thing to do. Certainly in the case where the mother's life is at risk, then I think there is a place where it's right, even in Christian thinking, to destroy the life of the child in order that the life of the mother will be saved. But it's important to understand here that when the mother's life is at risk in a pregnancy, if you do nothing, both the baby and the mother will die. If you intervene, the baby will die and the mother will live. So in this terrible situation, it's like death has already entered into the womb, and death will either hit both the mother and the baby, or it will only hit the baby and not the mother. And in that rare situation, I think it is right that the doctor to say, with a heavy heart, death is already here. I will move death towards the baby in order that the life of the mother will be saved. But in all other circumstances, I genuinely believe it is a better way for life to be preserved and to provide the support and the care and the love, both to the mother and the baby. You know, I have a sense of how painful this situation is. You know, I have had the amazing privilege to be a doctor in a rich country in the UK and to work in the National Health Service, where amazingly the government is prepared to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for an individual patient, and where the decisions we make are not influenced by money, where I can genuinely do what I believe is right for the patient and not worry about how many thousands of dollars it costs. And I know that for most doctors across the world, and for most doctors who are listening to this, that is not the situation, that money is a desperately important factor, that healthcare is expensive, that many people do not have resources, that the government may not have the resources, that mission hospitals haven't resources. So I know that all these healthcare decisions have to be balanced against the resources. And sometimes I understand that because of this, it's necessary to make decisions to say, we cannot care for this patient, we cannot care for this baby, we cannot care for this vulnerable person simply because it's too much money. And I understand that, and I don't think that's wrong. You know, I think that we are called to be wise stewards of the resources that we have. And, you know, we remember the parable of the talents when God, the owner gives his servants different talents, different amounts of money, and then he asks them how they have used their money. And so if you are working in a place where actually you have very little resources and you have very little talents, then what God is asking of you is much less. Whereas when you are working, as I have done, in a rich country, then you are much more accountable because you have been given a great deal. Much is required from those to whom much is lost, and much is given. But I do want to say, it's much more the attitudes, I think. It isn't, we shouldn't allow money to become the defining factor, because the most precious things are compassion and care and humanity and Christ-likeness. And these things are not a matter of money. These things are free gifts. So even if we cannot afford to provide the highest level of medical treatment, we can show compassion, we can show care, we can be the hands of Christ and share his love with people.